Welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about tacit collusion. And more than anything, I want to introduce tacit collusion in the context of the entrepreneurship class because we want our startup to be able to understand how collusion works such that they might be able to determine or better forecast whether or not this is taking place in a market they're planning to enter. This is sort of like the counterpart to the limit pricing comments during the entry deterrence lecture, where a firm expecting entry might price abnormally low to make the market look less attractive than it actually is. This is sort of our limit pricing strategy approach. If firms jointly are currently tacitly colluding, the prices in the market might look higher than what our startup or what our newcomer to the market might expect. And looking at their technological capabilities, they might say, well, wait a second, I can price way lower than these other firms. I should be able to capture the market. Well, that may or may not be true, but if it's the case that the current firms are pricing high, artificially high due to collusion, it could be the case that their costs are actually much lower than it looks like externally. Anyway, so we would want our entrepreneur, our startup, when approaching a new market, to be able to think carefully about, well, whether or not tacit collusion might be something that's explaining some of the pricing dynamics in the market. And this is important as regards anticipating how the incumbents might respond when you enter. Because if you enter and you have lower cost than everybody else, great. But what if you only think you have lower cost than everybody else, and then all of a sudden your margins are a lot narrower than you'd expected? Anyway, so that's sort of the main motivation for thinking about tacit collusion and for understanding how it works and to be able to get some sense of the dynamics of it such that our startup would have a little bit more awareness coming into the market. So firstly, I want to talk about profits in oligopolistic markets more generally. So with an oligopolistic market, we're thinking about a collection of firms with some degree of market power. So at one extreme, you could think of perfect competition where the firms have zero market power. The other extreme, you could think of a monopoly where the firm has full market power. And then you can think of lots of different things in between. Oligopoly competition is typically thought of where we'd have something along the lines of like 3 to 4, maybe 5 firms in the market. There's no set number, sort of like a ballpark figure. And the big idea is that you've got a small number of firms. Each of them could be a monopoly in their own right. And because they're carving up this market, they're paying very close attention to what the rivals are doing. So we're expecting the strategic response. Anytime we've got an oligopoly market, we're expecting that the firm is paying attention not only to how consumers will respond, but they're also caring a lot about how rival firms are going to respond. This gives rise to a situation that we can model a couple of different ways. So the first is through Bertrand. Bertrand is an oligopoly market where we think of the firms choosing prices. Cournot is an oligopoly market where we think of firms choosing quantities, right? You could choose the price, allow the quantity to adjust, that's Bertrand. You could choose the quantity, allow the price to adjust, that's Cournot. And you could think of differentiated products. The reason why this is, I'll separate this out to its own categories because lots of times when we introduce Bertrand, we're thinking about like the strict identical products Bertrand. And then lots of times when we're thinking about Cournot, we're actually thinking about very little product differentiation. And then with the differentiated products model here, we're explicitly thinking about a situation where products are different. All right, so then we'll talk about tacit and implicit collusion. We'll think about how this works in theory and then how firms in the market might be doing this in practice. Talk a little bit about the GE and Westinghouse historical example because there's some interesting things there in terms of the coordination that's necessary to make collusion work. All right, so here we're thinking about oligopoly pricing. The point of comparison is the monopoly price and monopoly profits. And the reason why I say that is because this is what the firms are striving for. This is where there's the majority of, this is where profits have been maximally extracted from the market. But that would happen in the situation where there's a monopoly. And so we're using this as our benchmark to think of like, what's the ideal from the firm's point of view? Well, it's trying to strive to get closer to the monopoly outcome. Well, you can think of the homogeneous product Bertrand, identical products Bertrand. Here we're thinking about price competition. So we have identical products and we're competing in price. This is basically the idea. I've got a video where I'm talking about the identical products Bertrand. This is, suppose we have two firms. They've got the same marginal cost of 100. They're currently setting prices at 200. What do we think is going to happen? Well, the price is going to go to 199, 198, 197, all the way down to marginal cost of 100. What if we had three firms? Well, same thing. 4 firms, same thing. Turns out with identical products, Bertrand, we're going to get the price equals marginal cost outcome, and you really only need 2 firms setting price equal to marginal cost for that to be stable. You can think about why that's the case. Suppose we have 2 firms in the market, as the example that I just gave verbally. We're setting price equal to 100, which is our marginal cost. Now we add a bunch more firms into the market. What are they going to do? Doesn't matter, right? They could price at 200 and then they're undercut by the firm setting price equal to marginal cost. They could set price equal to marginal cost. They're going to get 0 profits because price is equal to marginal cost. Or they could try to undercut and capture the market, but then they're going to make losses. It turns out it doesn't matter as long as you've got 2 firms setting price equal to marginal cost. That'll be the Nash equilibrium in a standard Bertrand identical products market. So we're thinking about a situation to make this happen where capacity constraints, not super important. It's easy for an individual to cut the price and then satisfy the demand of the entire market, right? The assumption that's kind of in the background of what I'm saying is that to be able to reinforce this pricing dynamic where the firms are mutually going to undercut each other, it's got to be the situation where by virtue of undercutting your rival, that rival loses all their customers because I'm able to serve the entire market. That can't happen if there's a capacity constraint, right? There's a limitation to the number of consumers I can serve or geographic region or whatever. Now all of a sudden there's not quite the same penalty to the rival when I cut my price below theirs. Anyway, so in a situation where capacity constraints are not important, this makes undercutting really tempting. In the extreme case, price is driven down to marginal cost, as I said. Let me talk a little bit about this. This is marginal cost of our firm. This is the Bertrand price. So the Bertrand price falls down to marginal cost in equilibrium, and we're assuming it's going to be something lower than what would be the monopoly price. All right. So in terms of what happens to the profits, well, the monopoly profits are typically going to be larger than the sum of our individual Bertrand profits. I mean, these very well, like in the extreme case, are going to be equal to 0, right? So if marginal costs are all constant, all profits are equal to 0. What if marginal costs not constant? So I gave my example. I said, suppose firms have marginal cost of 100. Well, suppose one of the firms has a marginal cost of 50. What's going to be the price? 99, right? So if we have a lot of firms with marginal cost equal to 100, some may be higher, and you have one firm with marginal cost of 50, the price is going to crash just low enough to be able to capture the market. Doesn't have to go all the way down to 50. You wouldn't want to do that because you don't need to. So if you're the one firm that's got the really low marginal cost of 50, you're going to take advantage of this to be able to capture the market, but you are going to price at 99 because you only need to be able to, in theory, undercut your rivals by a penny to be able to capture the market. And so that's the prediction. And anyway, so that would be the situation if all the marginal costs were either not the same or not a constant. All right. Now we'll think about the homogeneous product Cournot. So this is quantity competition. This is a situation where capacity constraints are important. The firms are choosing what's going to be their capacity, what's going to be their quantity, and maybe they're limited in terms of like the maximal quantity that they could provide. The idea is here is we're thinking of a situation where it's really difficult for the individual firms to cut the price and flood the market. And so therefore they're competing in quantity, everybody's setting their quantity into the market, and then this creates the joint market quantity, which then determines the price. But the idea here, strategically, we're influencing the market via quantity rather than through price. In the Cournot case, there's not as much downward pressure on prices as in the Bertrand model, meaning price doesn't necessarily cut down to marginal cost. It can, right? In the N-firm Cournot, we do expect prices are going to crash down to marginal cost. As we keep adding firms to the market, it starts to approach perfect competition. I mean, that should be natural, right? So think about what's happening. Each firm is choosing their quantity choice. As more firms enter the market, there's a larger quantity. Well, if the quantity rises, the price falls. It's just the law of demand. And so in the limit, it starts to look like competition. But in an oligopoly situation, the price is going to tend to be higher than marginal cost, at least at a rate much higher, with much greater frequency than we'd expect with Bertrand, where explicitly the goal was like setting price equal to marginal cost. Here we're expecting the Cournot price is going to be higher than the Bertrand price, which is typically going to be equal to marginal cost. And the weird thing you could get is if you had one firm with really high marginal cost, one with really low marginal cost, well, the Bertrand price would be closer to the firm with a higher marginal cost. Overall, the total industry profits with Cournot are going to be somewhere between the monopoly case and the Bertrand case. So positive, but somewhere in between. And largely dependent on the number of Cournot firms we have. So the Cournot price and total industry profits, yes, lower the more firms there are in the market. In the limit, it approaches perfect competition. What about the differentiated products situation? Now we've got product differentiation. And so even without capacity constraints, differentiation makes undercutting less tempting. Why? Well, the firms have some degree of differentiation. They have their own niche. And so it's not necessarily as clear that you need to be able to, well, even that there's as great of a benefit to lowering your price. Also, within your niche, you've got some degree of market power that is going to be retained regardless of what rivals do with their prices. Other things equal, this allows the prices to stay higher than in the standard identical products Bertrand or Cournot, and we expect the differentiated products model is going to have a price that's lower than monopoly case, higher than Bertrand, and typically higher than Cournot. All right, so the total industry profits with the differentiated products situation is going to give us positive profits, but not as great as monopoly profits. And indeed, yeah, total industry profits are going to be higher the more differentiated products they are. In the limit, each niche becomes its own individual monopoly, right? Okay, so in summary, in all these oligopoly situations, one's earning less profits than you would in a monopoly. Couple reasons. One is you're splitting up the pie. Second, there's a decreased size of the pie as we're sort of carving it up into smaller pieces. So how much lower profits we get than the monopoly profits depends on the situation, right? Is there capacity constraints? Is there product differentiation? What's exactly going on? And depending on those variables, you can be closer or farther from monopoly profits. All right, so the next thing we want to do is there something that the firms could be doing that raises their prices, increases their profits closer to the monopoly case? And yes, what they could be doing is they could do some type of tacit collusion. Before I go any further, like explicit collusion, explicit price fixing is like illegal. And so that we're not talking about that, because if you have evidence for price fixing, the Justice Department's going to be very interested in that, and they're going to put an end to it as quick as they're able to. With tacit collusion, we are thinking about this sort of legal gray area where the firms haven't explicitly agreed on price. There's some degree of coordination, typically through some external coordination device. And it's a type of thing where there's this sort of legal gray area in the sense of the antitrust officials are interested in what's going on. They're probably going to take a closer look, but it's not going to be per se illegal. So it's going to be the type of thing where they would be interested in investigating and learning, is there a compelling business reason for why these prices seem to be moving together or not? And if they're not, I mean, tacit collusion. So the idea is like they're not explicitly coordinating, but there's some underlying oligopoly dynamics that is allowing this collusion to take place without formal agreement. If it's the case that the justice officials, or if it's the case that our firm coming to the market feels as though they are a victim of this sort of tacit collusion, I mean, this is kind of where sometimes these antitrust cases come from. And so just because tacit collusion is not like explicitly illegal doesn't mean that it couldn't ultimately lead to like an interesting antitrust case later on, especially if there's evidence to bring to bear on the situation. So, I'll talk about some of this and some of the other interesting things during the antitrust slides. All right, so in this example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to think of this sort of collusion example, and I'm going to begin with thinking about a hypothetical collusion between two firms, United and then American. And what's happening is we have United choosing columns, high price or low price. We have American choosing rows, high price or low price. If United chooses high price and American chooses high price, they both get profits of 60. If United chooses high price and American chooses low price, United gets a payoff of 0, and American has undercut United and gets a high price of 100. Therefore, the first payoff is going to American, to row player. The second payoff in the matrix is going to column player, to United. Suppose they both price low, they both get payoffs of 30. Suppose United prices low and American prices high. Now United undercuts American and receives the payoff of 100, and American receives the payoff of 0. We can solve for the Nash equilibrium of the simple single game. That doesn't have anything to do with collusion. That's not dynamic. That's just like the one-shot game. What's the Nash equilibrium? We do this by solving for best response. So we'd say, okay, if hypothetically United were to choose high price, what does American want to do? Well, if American chooses high price, they're going to get 60. If they choose low price, they're going to get 100, conditional on United choosing high price. Well, so American wants to use low price. So I would underline low price, or the 100, following American's choice of low price when United has chosen high price. All right, so then what if United chooses low price? What does American want to do? Oh, again, American's payoff for choosing low price is higher than their payoff for choosing high price, right? So I would underline the payoff under 30. And if you're following what I'm doing, I would have underlined the 100 and underlined the 30, indicating that low price is always the best response for low price is always the best response for American to United's choice, regardless of what they're doing. We would therefore say that low price is a dominant strategy for American. Low price dominates, not United. Low price dominates high price. Low price is dominant over high price, meaning low price, other things equal, is going to be the better strategy for American. Let's check this now from United's perspective. Suppose American were to choose high price. Now we're looking at the top row. If United chooses high price, United gets a payoff of 60. If United chooses low price, they get a payoff of 100. Oh, they'd way rather have the payoff of 100, so United is going to choose low price. So I will underline the 100 following low price. What if American chooses low price? Now, if United chooses high price, they receive a payoff of 0. If United chooses low price, they receive a payoff of 30. 30 is bigger than 0. So I'd underline 30, and I've underlined 100. And if you followed what I've done, I've always underlined the payoff associated with low price for United, which tells us low price is a dominant strategy for United. Low price does not dominate American. Low price dominates United's other strategy, high price, right? Dominant strategies refer to how one strategy fares relative to my other options, not how it compares to my opponent. Okay, so both have a dominant strategy in the one-shot game to use low price. So our Nash equilibrium, actually a dominant strategy Nash equilibrium, is low-low, not 30-30. 30-30 are the Nash equilibrium payoffs when each plays low. Nash equilibrium refers to a situation when each firm is playing a strategy profile or playing a strategy such that nobody wants to be the only one to switch. And we can see this if both are currently playing low, each individually can only worsen their own individual situation by choosing high, right? So if we're currently down here and United switches from low price to high price, United switches from low price to high price, United goes from 30 to 0. Or suppose we're down here and American chooses from going from low price to high price. Now American can get this 0 here. That's bad. Nobody's going to want to deviate. So this is definitely this one-shot game. Nash equilibrium is low price, low price. All right, that's the rationalization for this right here. The standard equilibrium is low price, with each firm making profits of 30 million. Very much like a prisoner's dilemma. Let's see. So the prisoner's dilemma requires each firm has a dominant strategy and their payoffs are lower when they both use their dominant strategy jointly than if they were both to play their non-dominant strategy. We can see that by summing up. Let's just add up the payoffs. So here, 30 plus 30 is 60. 100 plus 0 is 100. 60 plus 60 is 120. Yes, joint social surplus is maximized when they both play their non-dominant strategy, but their individual incentives steer them towards low price, which is inefficient relative to this situation. So it is indeed a prisoner's dilemma we've been studying. Anyway, is there a way that we can do better? Well, yeah. Suppose the game is played repeatedly through time. Now, in the repeated game situation, there is scope for cooperation. So consider the following strategy. This is a collusive equilibrium strategy. This is a strategy that can perpetuate the high payoff, that can perpetuate collusion, cooperation into the future. So the strategy is two-part. Firstly, we will price high and continue to price high unless the other firm prices low. Secondly, the punishment phase. If any firm ever prices low, I'm going to start pricing low the next period and continue to price low for the next T periods. Right? So you need both of these to reinforce the Nash equilibrium, or reinforce the the cooperation as a Nash equilibrium. Is this a Nash equilibrium for firms to play this strategy? Yes, indeed. If they're both playing this, and if the punishment phase is sufficiently long, no one's going to have a profitable unilateral deviation. No one's going to want to do something else. Now, notice one thing that I did that was really important here is I didn't specify the length of the game. That's important because this indeed is a strategy in the sense of being a complete contingent plan, but it didn't have to give us the number of periods for the game because I already told us what we're going to do in every period. We're going to price high until somebody prices low. Then we're going to have a punishment phase where we price low, and then we'll go back to pricing high, right? If otherwise, like if we were writing down any other strategy, it would have to tell us what you're going to do at each iteration of the game. So it'd be something like high, 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 high for however many periods that is. Anyway, so is this a Nash equilibrium strategy? Yes. To answer this question, have to check whether it's profitable for any single firm to cheat, assuming all other firms follow the strategy. If not, it's a Nash equilibrium. Well, suppose I keep a high price. My profit stream is going to be 60, 60, 60, 60, 60 until something happens. Suppose I cheat and price low in a given period. I'm going to make higher current profits but lower future profits. So in the first period, I'm going to get 100 instead of that 60. In the second period, I'm only going to get 30 because they're punishing me. So after 2 periods, right, after I've cheated the first period and been punished the second period, my payoffs are 130. Whereas if I would have, for those first 2 periods, continued to cooperate, my payoffs would be 120. So I'd still rather cheat at this point. What if I get punished again? Now my payoffs are going to be 100 plus 60. That's 160. What if I, over 3 periods, what if I cooperated? 60, 60, 60, that's 180. Yeah, so with 2 periods of punishment, that's enough. If T is high enough in this game, 2 periods, that's enough to make it more profitable to keep cooperating over those first 3 periods than over these periods if I cheat and then am punished. And then certainly I've got, like, the punishment phase here is sort of arbitrarily long. I didn't tell us how many periods are in between. And so this would actually be an inefficiently long punishment phase because you could go back to cooperation here actually. But the basic idea is as long as the punishment phase is long enough in this situation, as long as you're punishing at least this period and this period, then your payoffs for cheating plus being punished is 160, whereas if you would have continued cooperating, it's 180. So you'd have an incentive to keep cooperating. As long as the punishment is severe enough, T is high enough, the first stream of profits will be higher than the second stream of profits. Right, so to find a Nash equilibrium strategy that would sustain cooperation in the repeated game, you'd have to say, okay, we're going to price high and continue to price high until the other firm prices low. And then you need to be explicit about what the punishment phase is. If any other firm prices low, I start pricing low the next period and continue to price low, in this case, for this game here, for 2 periods. All right. Anyway, if everyone's following this strategy, the firms aren't going to want to cheat, and this is an equilibrium. And in this tacit collusion equilibrium, the firms end up sustaining high prices, getting 60 million in this case, profits in each period. It's still not as good as monopoly profits. Monopoly profits was 100 perpetually, right? Monopoly profits, I didn't say it originally, but this is a monopoly, right? The other person's out of the market, other firms out of the market, we're in the market. Yeah, so the monopoly profits were better, but much better than the non-collusive outcome, which was 30 million. Indeed. All right, so the basic idea here is the threat of punishment, the threat of price cutting in the future deters cheating. So the hope is that having this strategy deters the cheating in the first place. That's the idea. It's supposed to be a deterrent effect that you actually just cooperate perpetually because of fear of this punishment. And so that reinforces and keeps a situation where nobody actually ever deviates. In general oligopolistic games, these punishment strategies typically generate higher profits than normal because it facilitates this type of collusion. In many cases, however, the monopoly price can be obtained, though one still has to divide the pie with competitors. So in many cases, you could be successful at replicating the monopoly price, but now you've got multiple firms in the market, and so you don't necessarily get the monopoly profits. All right, thinking about tacit collusion in practice, what types of things, what type of aspects make these beneficial, equilibrium easier to attain? Well, if you have a situation where you're able to reach an agreement, if there is some degree of monitoring of cooperation, and if there's punishment, right? And so if you're trying to enter a market and it looks like the looks like the prices are really high relative to your cost structure, and you're coming in as a startup and you want to ascertain whether or not there might currently be tacit collusion amongst the existing firms, one of the things to check for would be, is there some way that those firms could have facilitated some agreement? Is there some type of monitoring to make this collusive strategy stable over time, and some type of punishment to reinforce it? And if you can identify those things, now you've got concerns about the state of that market you're about to enter. All right, so one of the problems, it is per se illegal to explicitly discuss setting prices. That's price fixing. You can't do it. That's really bad, and there's going to be serious jail time, prison time for per se illegal market activity. So the key is how the firms are implicitly coordinating on what the collusive price should be. When I'm talking about you, I'm using sort of like the royal you, like kind of like you in general. I'm not talking about like advice for an entrepreneur. I'm saying like you as just any market participant. All right, potential problems. What's the price that people are willing to collude at? When firms sell a variety of products, coordination can be difficult because we've got a lot of different markets we're actually considering. And the more firms there are in the industry, the tougher it can be to coordinate because you've got more individual incentives. All right, so potential solutions. So focus on attaining the monopoly price. So that could be the price that we're expecting firms have focused on trying to collude at. One difficulty would be, does everybody know what the monopoly price actually is? Maybe they don't. Maybe it's the price prior to the entry of an additional firm or an important additional firm. And this would be something that antitrust regulators are really interested in looking at, is like when we have entry, if the price doesn't fall, that's typically going to be cause for further investigation as to what might be going on. It could be unilateral trial and error. We try a bunch of different prices and then we see what the market seems to settle at. Or try to simplify a complicated pricing strategy, as in, I'll talk about the GE and Westinghouse example. Sometimes there can be an external focal point for collusion. There could be like a natural price, or there could be like, typically we think of like a focal point, something outside of the game that everybody is aware of. Well, one kind of focal point for prices is like, $24.99 or like $99.99. Think of like dollar amounts, like just under $100 or just under $50 or just under $25 or just under $10. Like those are prices that become salient, and maybe that sticks in the minds of both firms. Another thing to think about is the role of monitoring. So here in the example that I gave, it's really easy to determine if your competitors cheated. You either see their low price of 30 or you see your profits go to 0 and they get 100. In practice, it's not so easy to monitor your competitor for a variety of reasons. One, posted prices might not be followed. There might be under-the-table discounts, and that's sort of unfortunately really common. One might argue that there's, even if it were the case, you could detect cheating by observing demand for your product. So if your demand for your product has changed drastically, like suddenly drops, maybe your competitor has been cutting prices. Could be, though there's other reasons why your demand might fall, but that's sort of one of the things that might cause sort of an interesting situation where you'd want to collect more information. One problem might be a result of simply low demand in the given time period. And one issue is like with imperfect observation, you may have to punish in practice even though your opponent might not have actually cheated, right? If you see your profits falling and we believe that the firms had been engaging in some type of collusion strategy, in order for the collusive strategy to be stable over time, those firms would need to engage in some type of punishment whenever they believe that there's been some type of cheating, so as to develop the reputation for reinforcing the collusive agreement. So that's a problem. All right, so for the summary, the more information there is about the firm's pricing decisions, the quicker the information comes and can be reacted to, the easier it is to tacitly collude. For collusion, for tacit collusion, information is important. For understanding what's behind the pricing dynamics is important for stability. And you can kind of see like ways that this can sort of be undermined by entry of an additional firm into the market. And as soon as the collusive agreement is gone, we might expect the incumbents to go back to whatever pricing advantage they have by virtue of their cost. And so the anticipated profits you might have coming into a market might not be as great as you had originally expected if there had currently been collusion and then it deteriorates and now you've got a lot fiercer competition than you'd expected. Then there's the punishment, right? So the threat of punishment is actually what was allowing the tacit collusion to take place. If there's no punishment, there can't be collusion. you're going to have something that would deteriorate very quickly in the game I showed us anyway, that would deteriorate back to like the one-shot prisoner's dilemma type game where you get the standard Nash equilibrium. The stronger the punishment for cheating, the better the chances of sustaining collusion. So the larger are the consequences and the greater is the opportunity cost of having cheated versus having continued along the path that firms have presently been on. On the other hand, punishing the opponents also hurts yourself. So that we see that where the firms are pricing low, that punishment strategy is sacrificing profits that both, for both firms in that situation. So there's this sort of counterbalancing incentive for firms not to make the punishment too bad. One problem though, punishment has to be credible, and you have to follow through with it without renegotiation. Otherwise, there's no kind of threat of punishment, and you have the issue where you have, like when we were talking about entry deterrence, you've got something where it's not sequentially rational to engage in the price war. Well, then we're going to expect the price war is just not going to happen. And so these are all the things that can kind of make punishment, monitoring, agreement are all the things that make collusion more stable. And then this is also the way that the reverse is the way that they can be undermined. Okay, so I will go into the GE and Westinghouse example. First, I want to show a picture. This is not a puppy study break. This is a Wolverine study break. And Wolverines are not supposed to be present in Michigan. They're supposed to be across Canada. A Wolverine was spotted in around 2004, I think, and then was found, had passed away in 2010. However, when I was running through the woods last year, I saw an animal I had never seen before. It was brown. It had a fluffy tail like this. It was sitting over a carcass, and when I came up on it, as soon as it saw me, it ran away fast. I got a pretty good look at the thing. I think it was one of these, although no biologist would ever agree with me. They would say, no, there's no Wolverines in Michigan, although there was one found in kind of like the thumb of Michigan, north of Detroit. However, I'm convinced this is what I saw. I've seen a lot of animals. I've seen coyotes. I've seen rabbits. Rabbits and coyotes, obviously it's not this. I've seen weasels. I've seen muskrats. I've seen bobcats. I've seen mountain lions. I've seen bears. I've seen moose. I've seen possum. Not all of these in Michigan, mind you. However, I've seen foxes. I saw a fox in the same area as I saw one of these. I think I saw one of these. Here, this is my story. I am sticking to it. However, it is unusual for me to see an animal and to not be able to know what it is. And I know one thing, which is like, I have never seen that animal before. I don't know that I'll ever see it again. And it was strange. It was kind of like this sort of surreal experience. So it was kind of like, what is that thing? What was that animal? And it was gone. So, all right. So General Electric and Westinghouse, here's sort of an example of tacit collusion, and you could think of kind of how these dynamics might impact a market. So it's a historical example. They're producing turbine generators. So so we're thinking of a situation where we want to talk about the producers and consumers in the market. We'll talk about a little bit about the purchasing product and purchasing process. I don't know. I'll kind of give like a quick sort of overview. I mean this in the context of the class as kind of like an illustrating example. I don't like questions where you're asking like kind of specific idiosyncratic details about something. The only time I've ever asked like specific questions about like specific cases or specific dates, like you think of like the horrific history exam where you have to know that like the date of a particular thing. One question that I think is a completely fair question would be like, not for an economics class, but for history class. I generally don't like questions where it's like date specific, but I do like the question, in what year was the War of 1812? That's a good question. Another question that I like is asking about when Cournot published Cournot's work, and then when Joseph Bertrand published Bertrand's work, and then when The Wealth of Nations was published. Well, Wealth of Nations was published in 1776. Cournot published Cournot's researches on mathematics. It's a Google ebook in French that you can find. Anyway, Cournot published that book in 1838, and then Bertrand published Bertrand's revision in 1883. So Cournot was 1838, Bertrand is 1883, and I think that's kind of cool. Anyway, so in terms of like how the competition and pricing had gone between GE and Westinghouse, well, initially they'd had these price books. And the problem was there's this like complex pricing strategy. They had a lot of related products, and they had different customers with different volumes, and they had this complicated pricing. So they had price books that would give guidance on prices. There had been convictions for explicit price fixing in the late 1950s. So this is an industry that already had the attention of regulators. And then there's this sort of known price history up to 1961. All right. The competitive situation coming into 1961 to 63, well, the firms had developed excess capacity, and then were focusing on sort of coordinating pricing without explicitly colluding. But there's a problem, and that's that, well, you've got the attention of regulators, and you can't like explicitly price fix because that's super illegal. What was making it so difficult to tacitly collude? Well, there's problems about the transparency of pricing and the complex pricing system, not able to explicitly price fix, these sorts of things. All right, so then what did they do? Well, GE came up with this unilateral tactic. They came up with a new price book, simplified formulas, standard features, and examples, and they published their price book. The prices were calculated by multiplying the book price by a standard multiplier initially set to 0.76, which was known. Then the multiplier gets adjusted due to demand conditions. They announced GE will sell to all customers at this published price without exception. This restores information, and this is sort of like overcomes the information problem for Westinghouse. There's this price protection clause promising the buyer that if prices were lowered within 6 months of purchase, GE would give the price break. They hired some auditors for compliance with the published price and the price protection policies, and then published a list of all the orders and quotations for several months prior to the announcement, with letters to clients, press releases. So they're publishing this policy, giving all this information. Ultimately, then, what did Westinghouse do? Well, they scrapped its own price book and adopted the GE simplified book. They adopted the 0.76 multiplier, and then in June of 1964, GE sees this. They reduce its multiplier, and they're claiming suspected price cutting by Westinghouse. July 1964, Westinghouse announces a price increase, publishes outstanding orders and quotations, institutes a price protection clause. You can see they're kind of coordinating. What does the government do? Well, they weren't happy, and they figured out what was going on. So they forbidded price protection, the price protection policy, the price matching. You'd actually think like price matching. You might think that price matching policies are good for consumers. No, it actually like goes against competition. There's some interesting logic for why that's the case. But anyway, so they limited the distribution, restricted distribution of price books, prevented communication outside the company in terms of negotiation strategies, the formula or system for pricing, and the percentage of the book price, their multiplier. No longer could they publish outstanding bids, but the prices stayed stable. And the question is why? Well, the answer is it had to do with information. They'd already established this information, this guidance, which now created this external mechanism that they were able to use to continue to coordinate prices. This is sort of an interesting case study, both for the standpoint of the government and antitrust legislation, regulation, from the standpoint of the firms in the market, and for thinking about like if you're approaching a market where you think there might be possibility for tacit collusion. One of the big things is the question about the information. So thinking about, do the incumbent firms have the ability? Do they have do they have information about each firm's own pricing strategy, pricing philosophy? And is it the type of situation where it's pretty obvious that they could be coordinating using that information? So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this section of slides. I'm going to go ahead and conclude this video right here.